Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Debbie Ingalls, Director of the Cool Climate Oenology and Viticulture Institute here at Brock, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, our very own viticulturist, Dr. Jim Willwerth. Jim's position is a unique position here at CCOVI. 50% of his time is spent on outreach to the grape and wine community and 50% on applied research. And today he's going to talk to us about some very interesting work that he's been doing on grapevine cold hardiness that ties into an outreach program that we've developed for the industry called Vine Alert. So a little bit about Jim's background, his educational background. He has a Bachelor of Science from St. Mary's University in Halifax and graduated in that program way back in 2001. Then went on to do his certificate in grape and wine technology here at Brock University. And then from there continued on to attain his PhD in Dr. Andrew Reynolds' lab in plant sciences, enology, and viticulture, and graduated with his degree in 2011. So today he's going to be talking to us about the effect of prolonged cold events and what that effect has on grapevine buds, survivability, viability. So, thanks, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be back here speaking at the CCOVI lecture series. And today, yes, I'm going to speak about the current issues surrounding grapevine cold hardiness and some of our research developments here. So basically, some of my talk today is going to tie into some of my research that I'm doing, but also some of the outreach that we have as well. So based on the winter that we've been having, I tried to put together a talk that deals with some of these current issues that we have and some of the work that we're doing here at the university to understand more about the effects of some of these prolonged cold events. So just to give a quick overview, Debbie talked a little bit about this already in the introduction, but CCOVI's been actively involved with research and outreach, and in terms of the viticulture side of things concerning grapevine cold hardiness since 2010. In 2010, we launched the Vine Alert program, which is our regional cold hardiness program where we're monitoring cold hardiness in grapevines across Ontario. We're looking at bud survival, temperatures, and alerting the industry when mitigation should occur to help, or when protective measures should occur to help mitigate cold injury. Some of the research programs that I'm involved with are looking at optimizing cold hardiness in vinifera vines, and some of the studies include crop level studies looking at water stress, disease, and so on. I'll talk a little bit about that today. All of this funding is through collaboration, or it's all collaborations between the university and industry, as well as funding through federal and provincial levels, at federal and provincial levels. So just to give another overview here, just in terms of freeze injury. Basically, freeze injury in grapevines or other crops, perennial crops, can occur at really any time. And this can be while the plants are acclimating, it can be in the midwinter months, while the plants are coming out of dormancy, or what we call deacclimation, or as well frost injury due to after bud break. And in 2012, for example, I think we all recall it was very, very warm, much different year than this year, and I'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But in that year, we had a lot of injury during the later parts of dormancy, including deacclimation and post bud break, especially in the tender fruit crops when the apples and so on were in bloom. So the one other point I want to get across is that we do have freeze injury that occurs every year in Ontario. And this is either direct injury from this past winter, for example, or from previous years of winter injury, such as things that happen in the trunks and so on. And a lot of times, the grower sees these loss of vines and so on, but it's not necessarily a widespread loss. But we do find some effects of freeze injury every single year. And these are just some illustrations of just what winter injury looks like. So these are some Chardonnay vines that had some significant bud injury, and you can see there's no growth on the top of the vines and just some suckering down below. When I say suckering, it's just shoots pushing from the base of the trunks. Another example, this is post-bud break. So this is a bud that was fried from a spring frost in 2012. Some cane injury, so these are when there's some splitting in the trunks, and this can lead to direct death, but also allow diseases such as crown gall, which is a trunk disease, to enter the vine and cause further problems as well. This was an example of one of those years of combined winter injury, where there's injury that occurs within the trunk and so on. And you could see that some vines are okay, and other vines just completely collapsed and didn't survive the winter. And this wasn't necessarily from a lot of severe events from the previous winter, but from many winters prior to that. And it just basically death of 1,000 cuts within that trunk. Similarly, this is what happens later in the season. We call this some shoot or vine collapse, where everything starts off okay, and then due to some vascular damage within the vine, we get some collapse. Again, just another example where this whole half of the vine perished and there was nothing alive on this side. And then this is an example of direct injury to the buds itself. So this is the primary bud of the grapevine compound bud, and you can see it's very brown, which shows that this bud is dead. And this is what we use for a lot of our bud survival estimates, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And here is another bud, the secondary bud, which is alive. So what are some consequences of cold injury? One of the first things and most important things really is just loss of fruit. If there's bud injury and the primary buds are damaged, we won't get much fruit, particularly in vinifera vines. We'll have loss of fruit. This correlates also with uneven or poor vegetative growth. We can have complete loss of vines, or vines killed right to the ground, and they'll have to be retrained. And when we do have some trunk damage and so on, we can get higher incidence of disease, specifically crown gall. And all of this results in loss of uniformity, loss of consistency, increased management costs. So not only are we having a loss of fruit, but the management costs to manage that acreage also increases, because we're dealing with all of these other things. And so ultimately we're getting reductions in yield, quality, and profit in the vineyards and wineries. So in terms of what is cold hardiness, I'll talk about cold hardiness a lot. Cold hardiness is the ability of a plant tissue to survive freezing. It's a very complex trait. There's a lot of factors that are involved, including the genetics in the environment, and it's a highly dynamic condition. So when I say it's a highly dynamic condition, we basically have these three stages of hardiness. The first stage is acclimation, when the vines are gaining, or plants are gaining cold tolerance. In the midwinter months, we reach this period of maximum hardiness. And then once the temperatures warm up and the plants have reached their required chilling units and so on, and they will start to deacclimate. So right now, we're right around here. We're right to the point where if we start getting some warmer temperatures, we're going to start to see the vines deacclimating. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some cultivar differences. We grow a lot of different varieties here in Ontario, and over the years, I've tested a lot of different grapevine cultivars. There's a lot of people experiment with new varieties. We have a lot of varieties in the ground, like I say here, over 32 varieties that are actually VQA approved. They have a lot of different groups of origin, from either Western Europe, some from the Middle East and so on. So these have different levels of cold tolerance. Then we have our French hybrid varieties, when you think of varieties like Vidal and Baco Noir. And then there's some new varieties that are gaining interest, especially in our non-traditional grape growing areas. And these new hybrids are extremely cold hardy, and some of these are your Frontenac, Marquette, and so on. And so we have new cultivars to our region, both some of these new hybrids, but also a lot of new vinifera as well. And so what I want to do is show you some variation within and between some of these different categories. So here's some of our key core cool climate varieties that we're well known for, and we have some dedicated conferences and so on just for these to showcase these varieties. So here's just an example of Riesling, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir, and just some of their mid-level or midwinter cold hardiness levels. And you can see they're tolerant to early or about -21 to -23, when we'll start to sustain some real damage for some of our core varieties. So these are some of our more cold tolerant ones, and ones that we depend on. Similarly, we grow a lot of the different Bordeaux varieties, and I just wanted to show you some of the different hardiness levels for these varieties. So they're all considered Bordeaux varieties, but you can see their tolerance levels vary quite a bit. So some of our more sensitive ones that we grow are the white Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. Semillon we don't have very much planted, and a lot of that is due to its level of cold tolerance. It's not very cold tolerant at all. Sauvignon Blanc is very tender, but also a Merlot, which is one of our core red varieties. And you can see, especially when you look at the LT50 values, it's only hardy to about -20 in most years. So it is one of our more susceptible varieties, whereas our Cabernet Franc, which is one of our workhorses for the Bordeaux reds, is a little bit more tolerant. And then some rarities here. There's not too much of these planted in Ontario, but there's some data there for those from Malbec and Petit Verdot. Similarly, these are some more experimental varieties in some instances, other cultivars of Vitis vinifera. So another one of our sensitive varieties is Syrah, and you can see the tolerance levels there, around -19, -21, whereas some other varieties like Auxerrois are a little bit more cold tolerant. And in between, Gewurz is fairly cold sensitive, and some of these other varieties, such as some of the Italian ones, Sangiovese, are also quite tender. So again, these are more experimental varieties for the most part, except for Syrah and Gewürztraminer. Sauvignon, there's some increase in plantings, but even then. And then we look at some of the different hybrid varieties. So you look at Vidal, which is a huge workhorse for us. It's hardy to about -27 for LT50s. And then you look at the Minnesota varieties, and they're hardy to below -30. So these are our most cold tolerant varieties that we grow. And based on some of the temperatures we've had this year, Vidal, for example, has sustained some injury, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So some people think Vidal, it's a French hybrid, it's going to be really, really cold tolerant. It's not as cold tolerant as probably a lot of people think. So I wanted to give an overview here of just the current state of things and what's happened from the growing season up to this point. And for the 2013 growing season, it was quite variable. We had some cooler periods to start off. It was a little bit later of a bud break than other years. It was cooler and wetter, but then we also had periods where it was hot and dry as well. A typical Ontario vintage, right? Quite variable. But in the fall, it was cooler, it was a bit wetter, and ultimately we had a record-breaking crop. So because of the growing season and the size of the crop, the vines acclimate at, let's say, an average rate, I would say, based on the 5 years of data or so that we have so far, and similar to about 2011. And I'll show you some of the acclimation curves to explain that. But after leaf fall, we've had some warm periods in November and December, but then this was followed by some real cold snaps starting December 16th, 17th, and the 24th. And that should be the 24th, 25th. It was Christmas Eve. Sorry, that's just a typo. And these events were events where the temperature dropped quite rapidly in the evening. And in some cases, such as December 16th, the coldest time was like around 7:30 at night. And then it warmed up closer to midnight. So it was very, very sharp drops and very strong inversions. So we had a lot of warm air up top and a lot of cold air that settled to the ground, and about 10-degree inversions. So wind machines were very effective in those periods. However, we've had a cold winter. It's been cold, started in the end of December, and it got really cold in January. And this whole polar vortex thing has continued from really the first week of January and lean into the whole month really into February, and it's even a bit colder now. We're warm now, but it's supposed to get cold again in the middle of the week. So we've been basically below normal for the whole winter. And we've had over 10 events throughout Ontario, and some have been below -20, and some events have been even colder than that in terms of below -24. Sometimes in some areas, thank God it's areas where they bury the vines, but they've reached temperatures below -30. So obviously this has impacted some of our bud survival rates. And this is just an example of why we're getting a lot of these temperatures. The Great Lakes are the most frozen they've been since '79. So it's been over 20 years since they've been, there's over 90% ice coverage on the lakes. And Lake Ontario, I think, is about 40%, and that's big for Ontario. Basically, if Ontario would freeze, we would have no tender fruit or grape industry at all. We would lose everything. So it's a deep lake, but for example, Lake Erie's been frozen for a while now, and that's impacted some of our grape growing regions, and I'll talk about that. And this is just an example of Lake Erie right now. That's, if you know that, that's the Point Abino Lighthouse. So here's just an example of a couple different events that have occurred. This was the first polar vortex that came through, or I guess it's the same polar vortex, but the very first major cold event that we had that was widespread was during January 6th and 7th. And in this area, this time the winds were quite high. No one in Niagara or elsewhere could use any wind machines. And you could see that the temperatures were pretty consistently cold right across the board in Niagara. We've had a couple in between, but here's just another example of one that was February 16th. And you can see here along the lakes, the temperatures weren't as severe compared to areas such as Grimsby and West St. Catharines, for example, where the temperatures dropped down to below -23 in some cases. Now, when I talked about that frozen Lake Erie, this had a big impact here in southwest Ontario, and they've had multiple events in southwest Ontario where temperatures have gone below -24. And now, based on some of those numbers I showed you previously in terms of cultivar tolerance, you can assume that we're probably dealing with some winter injury in these types of situations. And the most extreme data that we have is from the end of January in Prince Edward County, where temperatures at some of the weather stations reached -36.7. So that's quite extreme, and that's why in the county they bury the vines with soil and or use other types of protection methods, because even the hybrids, based on those temperatures, are going to sustain some injury. And all of this data are just courtesy of Weather Innovations. So what I want to do is show you some information that's on our Vine Alert webpage. And so what I did is taken some snapshots just to show you how useful this program is for the grower, but also for me to explain things, because all this data is sourced and located on this website. So here's an example of an acclimation curve for this year so far for Cabernet Franc. And as the temperatures decreased, we have an increased intolerance for Cabernet Franc. These LT 10, 50, and 90. So the temperatures at which it's predicted that 10%, 50%, or 90% of buds would be killed. And you could see that in Lake Erie North Shore, for example, they didn't have that real big cold snap in December that we had in Niagara here. But when the polar vortex occurred, we had some severe temperatures at that time, which resulted in over 90% damage. And we can see that just even based on our predictions here. So when this minimum temperature drops below any of these LT values, we can expect some injury. And so what we do then is we follow up and we do bud survival assessments to get an actual number. Similarly, looking at a different area, but this is in the Beamsville Bench here in Niagara, you could see at the same time of year, again, there wasn't any cold event that was damaging in December, but at the beginning of January, during that polar vortex, we had some injury where the temperatures dropped down to about -22 degrees Celsius, and it resulted in over 40% damage to most of the cultivars there. In terms of how the vines are acclimated, or how they've acclimated over the years and what they're like right now, here's just an example of Cabernet Franc at the 4 Mile Creek sub-appellation. And right now follow this red line. This is 2013, 2014. And you could see that we acclimated at a slower rate compared to some other years. So again, like I mentioned earlier, we're acclimating similarly to how that was in 2009, 2010, 2011. 11-12, and the vines did not reach the same level of hardiness that they have in some of our other years, like 2010, and we're also staying quite cold hardy at this point in time because it's been so cold. Whereas you could see in 2012, when we had that abnormally warm weather, the vines were already deacclimating at this stage, and probably were already about 10 degrees less cold tolerant than they are now, or maybe 5 degrees less cold tolerant than they are right now. So based on the state of the lakes and so on, I don't think we're going to see this type of thing this year, and we're going to look more like we did in some previous years. So the take-home message here is that vines will acclimate differently from year to year, reach a different level of hardiness on any given year, and the same with deacclimation, and it's highly weather dependent. Here's just an example of a summary slide of some of the bud survival numbers currently in Niagara for some of the different varieties that we sample. So you can see it's highly variable in terms of the minimum and maximum, depending on where they're grown and what temperatures were reached. And then here's some of the averages. So we're looking at injury in most of the cultivars where we're going to have to mitigate and do some different pruning strategies and so on for some cases. But in the maximum sides, there are some very good numbers as well. So again, it's highly variable and it is dependent on varieties. Lake Erie North Shore, for example, has, based on some of the other data I showed you, you can expect that there's some more severe injury in this region because of those minimum temperatures that we reached. And that is shown here in the data. In terms of just looking at certain varieties, if you look at Cabernet Franc, for example, this is the variability across the Niagara region. And this is one reason why we sample in each one of these different sub-appellations, because it can be highly variable in terms of the temperatures reached and the corresponding bud hardiness and also bud survival. So we're looking at some areas where we have more damage on top of the escarpment. For example, there's more damage than compared in that area compared to 4 Mile Creek, for example, or the Lakeshore site. Cabernet Sauvignon, similar to Cabernet Franc. Merlot, remember I said that Merlot was one of our sensitive cultivars, and you can see here with the average bud survival numbers here that the Merlot is pretty beat up at the moment. But again, it's highly variable in terms of location. Some areas here where we've hit -23 a couple times compared to an area that hasn't had as many significant cold events. And that's reflective in some of the bud survival data. Pinot Noir is looking better than some of the other cultivars in terms of its bud survival numbers. But again, it is variable. Chardonnay, one of our other workhorse varieties. Similarly, we have some areas where it's a bit more beat up compared to some other areas. And Riesling, similar to Chardonnay. Look at some of our other varieties, again, looking at some of the different variation from cultivars, but also locations as well. So here again are some of our sensitive varieties such as Sauvignon Blanc, and again, highly variable in terms of the amount of damage depending on the location. Syrah, same thing. But again, if you look at the average survival, the numbers are down quite a bit. But like I mentioned before, we've had a severe winter and we're even seeing some damage in Vidal. And in areas, this number, which looks quite bad, is in a really cold area on top of the escarpment. And so therefore, that's reflective of some of the injury there. Whereas in some cases, I mean, Vidal's in very good shape. So this is just an example of showing the various cold events we've had this year and the corresponding bud survival following these events. So I wanted to show a sensitive variety like Sauvignon Blanc. But you can see here how many times the minimum temperatures have dipped down close to LT, close to our predicted LT values. So these are all circumstances where damage may have occurred. And in some of these cases, wind machines could be used because it was a clear, or it was calm conditions, and there was an inversion, so you could actually pull warm air down. But some of these, there's nothing a grower could do because the winds were so high. We're looking at, in some cases, 30-kilometer-hour winds and temperatures dropping below -20, 22. In that case, you can't really do much about that. It's and that's just the nature of some of the cold events we've had this particular year. So here's an example where we're in good shape at the end of December, and then we started to have some of these cold events. So this was the first polar vortex, and it resulted in about 40% damage. There was another cold event just right after that one, and it didn't really result in too much more damage, which is good to see. But then after a period of warming, and then again another sharp drop in temperature, we ended up losing a lot more buds in this particular site. And then this just continues. So you can have a cumulative injury over the winter. You will get, if it's one long event, you will get some knockdown, and then it may not be as severe. right after that. But then if there's a warming event and it's a completely separate cold event, you'll see a huge decrease in numbers again, or you can see a huge decrease in numbers again, depending on the minimum temperatures reached. Now, I wanted to put this slide up here. Why do I have more damage than my neighbor? Because I wanted to explain why bud survival can be so variable. So there's a combination of different factors. One, I showed this earlier, was variety. The different varieties have different levels of cold tolerance. Secondly, the site location, your site itself and the microclimates and mesoclimate that you have at your site and the absolute temperatures that are reached. Obviously, that's going to have an impact as well. Things such as vine health and vine age. If your vines aren't healthy, it's just like us. If we're stressed or we're not feeling well and if we get a virus, it's going to make the situation worse. It's the same thing with plants and vines. The way the management practices, how you manage your vines, whether it's through your types of training system you use, how you prune your vines, and if you have what we call spare parts, and I'll talk a bit about that, and the way the vines are managed in terms of canopy management. This can all impact bud survival. Water, both too little or too much in terms of water status, or too much water and the vines don't shut down properly in the late fall. And this also goes towards drainage as well. If there's pockets where there's poor drainage in the vineyard, you're going to find those are going to be the vines the first to die. And especially after a cold winter like this. The cold winter are going to tease out a lot of these different things. And one of the other things is crop levels, and talking about overcropping and undercropping. And I did mention about how we had a large crop this year and how that can impact bud survival rates. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some research here just quickly in terms of crop level and harvest date. So this is some work we've done to look at the combined effects of different crop levels for different varieties as well as timing of harvest. So what I want to take home message here is that heavy crops can increase the probability and severity of cold injury. Again, it's a stress factor, and this can lead to poor acclimation. And we're trying to find is different crop levels that can be, or optimal crop, we're trying to find optimal crop levels because crop levels can be both cultivar and site specific. So what we really want to do is achieve balance, and again, balanced vines produce better quality but also better hardiness. So right here I just want to say that, that through manipulation of crop levels you can change the reserves in overwintering wood and so on, and all of this is interconnected. So by removing fruit early in the season, you can encourage root development. Too much fruit will restrict growth in the vine, and if you leave too much fruit late in the season, the fruit will not mature, and neither will the wood properly, and you can have less success in terms of overwintering. So here's an example of acclimation rates for Sauvignon Blanc from two different crop levels at two different times of harvest. So these next couple slides that I'm going to show have 4 different treatments. One of them is a half crop vine, which is 1 cluster per shoot, and a full crop vine, which are 2 clusters per shoot, and then 2 different timings of harvest. One which is like the standard harvest, which is like the normal commercial harvest, and the other one which is later, which is about a month later. And you can see here that when there's a larger crop and it's harvested later, the acclimation rates, at least for this given year, are slower. And then as time progresses, these vines will catch up, but generally will not be as cold tolerant, at least in this vintage for this variety. So again, crop level is having an impact because you can see here that these vines with full crops are a little bit less cold tolerant, and then with the later harvest also further delayed the acclimation of these vines. Now in 2012 for Sauvignon Blanc, we didn't find much of a difference, and these are the results so far for this year. Again, what we're finding is that the larger crops at the beginning were slower to acclimate, but then they did catch up. And the most tolerant Sauvignon Blanc vines were the ones that had a lighter crop, half crop, and were picked at the normal commercial harvest. But the later harvest here seemed to have an impact in terms of acclimation rate here, and then also maximum hardiness. So I'm not sure really what's happening there. But again, it's variable from both the crop levels on the vines, but also the vintage as well. And you're going to see this as well for some of the other slides. Here's just an example of Pinot Noir. Again, slower acclimation rates for those heavier crop vines, but at the end of the day, they were all pretty similar at maximum hardiness for 2011-12. But the following year, you see a bigger separation in terms of how the later harvests were slower to acclimate, the larger crops were slower to acclimate and never reached the same level of hardiness as the lighter crop Pinot Noir. So Pinot Noir in last vintage was very, very susceptible to, not susceptible, but very responsive to crop levels. For Riesling, not so much. These are fairly similar trends here regardless of timing of harvest or the crop level. But in 2012, again, what we're seeing is slower acclimation rates for those larger crop vines and not the same level of hardiness for some of those heavier crop vines as well. And you can see the trends that we generally see. This is a lot has to do with just the environmental conditions. And that's why we're seeing similar, different absolutes, but similar rates for most cases, except for certain times of the year. And this is Riesling so far from this year. And very similar, except for this later harvest. This later harvest treatment is a lot slower to acclimate. Chardonnay has been quite responsive to some of our different crop levels. So this was last year, and the later harvest that was a full crop, so 2 clusters per shoot, acclimated at a much slower rate and did not reach the same level of hardiness. And that's a big difference. That's over 4-degree difference at this time of year. So if we had a cold event that was, let's say, negative 16 at this time, so at the end of November, these vines, you can argue, would all be, not all be, but would have some significant injury, whereas these vines here would not. And that's part of the purpose of this work, is try to understand how these different cropping levels and harvest dates impact the cold hardiness dynamics. Because if we just look at maximum hardiness, sure, they're even right here, but if we could have cold events anytime prior to that, which can result in injury. And this is this past year here, and again, the heavier crop loads or levels are impacting both the acclimation rate and or acclimation levels here, as well as maximum hardiness. Merlot. Not as much separation in terms of the different treatments, but again, slight differences here for some of the later harvests in terms of rates at acclimation or levels during acclimation. And at this time of year, we're actually finding that some of the later harvests are the ones that are more susceptible than some of the early harvests. So, crop level appears to have some effects on cold hardiness dynamics, but it is kind of hit or miss. There's a lot of variability from different varieties as well as different seasons. However, it does seem that there's more impact during acclimation, in that if you have an earlier harvest in a lighter crop, you can have greater levels of cold tolerance. But the one thing I will say is that, and I think we're seeing some of this year, and so for some of our later Bordeaux varieties, that the larger crops that we've had on some of our later reds probably has had an impact on some of the levels of bud survival that we are seeing in some of those cultivars. That if the vines were overcropped, they probably were not as cold tolerant as they could possibly be. The other aspect I want to talk about that we've been dealing with this winter has been these long sustained cold periods and bud freeze injury. So what happens when we have these long periods of cold weather that are below, or I should say above, our predicted LT10 values? So these are levels that we would predict, oh, they're not going to cause injury, but we have these temperatures for a long period of time. So in some cases we're predicting, let's say that Merlot is is tolerant to negative 18 degrees Celsius. but we've had temperatures at -15, slightly above those lethal temperatures for 15 hours. How does that impact bud survival? Does this lead to more damage? So the one point I have here is that quick freezing temperatures will likely cause localized damage. So if we have a sharp drop in temperature, it may not be widespread damage in the vineyard, it may be certain localized areas in that vineyard. When we have longer periods of cold, that cold air just settles everywhere throughout the block. So instead of settling in the low pockets, it'll settle everywhere and the whole vineyard is impacted. So you have a greater likelihood that vines can reach those critical temperatures. But what is happening with the vines? Like, if the vines if the buds are at -15, let's say, for 15 hours, will the bud start getting knocked off slowly? It's just like us going outside without a jacket on. If we go with a jacket on, we're fine for a while, and then we will eventually succumb to the cold. We won't last forever. And so can the vines be the same way, where eventually they'll succumb to the cold because of extended cold periods and freezing. So what we did here, I see Tom's here, which is fantastic. We work with technical services here at the university to help change our programmable freeze runs and try to find ways to mimic an extended cold event. So this is an example of, I wanted to show, this is some software that was actually developed here at the university to help us do this. And what this bottom graph here is basically showing our temperature run that we did. We have a holding period, and then what we do is we drop this temperature by 4 degrees Celsius an hour. And in a normal run, what we do is we keep dropping this until we reach -40, and then we warm it up. So we're trying to mimic a standard cold event. But in this case, what we did was we had that normal stabilization period, then we dropped the temperature by 4 degrees Celsius until we reached a temperature that was slightly above our predicted LT values. So we did some control treatments where we actually did the normal freeze run, and we predicted the temperature of, this was Riesling, to be the LT damage. So we'll start to see some damage around -20 degrees Celsius, -20, -21. So we decided, okay, let's hold the temperature at -18 for an extended period of time and see if we start getting some injury. And then what we'll do is we'll ramp them down like a normal run. So this is an example of a typical data that we get from our processed runs. And here is what we call the the high temperature exotherm. So this is when free water, extracellular water is freezing. And then if you see here, we have these very small peaks, and these are the low temperature exotherms of when the buds are actually freezing. Then we have intracellular freezing, which is a lethal event. So if I zoom in here, you can see we have periods during the run where we have different peaks. So later in the run, after we've dropped it down, we found this section of peaks here. But during this time of the held temperature, we do see the odd bud peak, which is very interesting for us to see. It didn't happen right away. Oops, if I go back. It didn't happen right away. Like right here, as soon as we dropped it down, we didn't have the damage. It happened hours after. And then we had our normal predicted temperatures, which we would normally see under a standard run. So this is what we did. It was with Riesling. We did the standard freeze runs where we had it from 4 degrees to -40, dropping 4 C per hour. And then we did the extended freeze run, which went from 4 C to -18 and down the same ramp of 4 C an hour. And then we held that for 16 hours. And then following that period, then we ramped it down to -40 C. And here's just some of the data from our predicted LT10 5090s. Fairly similar in terms of our values. The extended freeze run though, the LT50, which is the data that I trust the most, was half a degree higher than our normal freeze run. But what was most interesting was that we had 17% of the buds froze prior to that predicted LT10 temperature. So this shows that that sustained cold can have an impact on some buds. And that the average time for Riesling, if the buds were at -18, close to -19, the average time for those buds to die of that 17% were about 10 and a half hours. So that's a kind of a good thing, because negative 10 or negative 19 for 10 hours is quite a long period. We haven't had too many events like that, but we have had some events like that in Ontario this year, particularly in Lake Erie North Shore. And so this is why you're getting, you know, up to another 15 to 20% more bud death when you have this extended cold. And in terms of the range, we had minimum of 8 hours and maximum of 13 hours. For the buds that we saw that froze within that period. So this is very preliminary data, but I wanted to share this because this is one question a lot of growers have been asking, is what impact are these prolonged cold events having? And I think now we could say, well, we're probably losing some buds because of it. And a variety like Merlot, which is very sensitive, or Syrah, if it's hardy to negative 20 and we're getting negative 15, negative 16 for 8 hours, we're probably losing more of those buds than we would be for something like Riesling. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was just what to do after cold injury. I've talked about we have injury this year. What are things that you can do? And I wanted to have this as kind of a timely talk this year for the lecture series, so I did want to talk about this because this is one of the issues we're having. So one of the first things to do is obviously assess the level of damage that you have. So we post all of this data on the Vine Alert webpage for regional bud survival data for different varieties and so on, but it really is important to also assess the level of damage that you have at your own site as well. So the first priority is actually maintaining, trying to keep those vines alive. And then what you want to do is help mitigate any of the effects on cold injury from production, and obviously keep the renewal parts of the vine going so that you're going to get back and recover as quick as you can, both in growth in terms of as well as production. So some of the different strategies that have to change when you have winter injury are right now during the dormant period, but also during the growing season. So some of these include pruning, in adjusting pruning methods, and I'll talk about that, suckering, training, and basically you have canopy management, but also sucker management if you're retraining new trunks. You have to watch crop levels, nutrition, as well as weeds become more of an issue now if you're bringing things back from the ground. So in terms of nutrition, if you're retraining vines, you do not want to be putting a bunch of nitrogen and nutrients on these vines, because you don't want to you're going to have a huge root system and not much growing up top. And the smaller amount of, or the less number of growth points you have, the more push you're going to get from that root system. So you don't want to be fertilizing much this year. You want to retain good wood for the following year. Also, if you're bringing up suckers from the ground, weeds become an issue. So you want to be really proactive early with the weed control, with pre-emergence and that type of thing. And you still want to be spraying. You don't want to not spray. You want to have healthy leaves, healthy wood to get those vines back as quick as possible, and not to be further compromised. So in terms of proper assessments, like I said, we do a lot of assessments, and that's all part of the Vine Alert program, but it is important to do assessments for different varieties in different locations of the blocks that you have and determine the level of injury. And basically the level of injury that you have is really dictates what kind of guidelines that you're going to use and what choices you're going to be left with, really. So here's an example of a way to see what kind of damage you have, and that's just to basically slice buds, and to look to see if you have this browning at all in some of your, particularly the primary bud, which is that largest bud in the center. And we've done a couple workshops across Ontario already talking about this. So in terms of pruning, what your goal of pruning is, you want to get that vine back into health, you want to get it back into production, and then back into balance. That's the real key in terms of what you want to do. And you may lose some vines right away, and you may have some trunk injury or collapse, not even this year, but following years. And I showed that one slide of Riesling vines. That was 2009, after 3 years after 2005. And 2005 is probably when most of that injury occurred. So the goal of pruning is you're removing a lot of plant parts, but you particularly want to removing parts that you know are damaged or suspect to be damaged. And also use these things called, use a lot of spare parts, so extra plant material, such as leaving these types of things, leaving suckers and retaining wood for extra trunks and so on. Leave extra canes, extra trunks, and so on. That's really important. So here's just a general pruning modifications based on bud damage. If you have slight bud damage, you just prune as normal. That's the general recommendation. When you start having roughly up to 30% injury, you want to increase your normal bud numbers by about 50%. And again, think about bringing up new suckers, renewal suckers to establish new future trunks. In this range, which we're seeing quite a bit this year, 31 to 50% range. Again, these are just estimates in terms of numbers, but you want to be leaving double the amount of buds. So if you generally leave 2 canes of 10 buds each, you want to leave 4 canes of 10 buds each. You can always leave extra canes, and if you can always remove them if you don't need them later in the season. But use these things like kicker canes, so you may tie down 2 canes and leave 2 more and wait to see what pushes, and if not many buds push, then you could tie down those second canes. If you have good growth on the fruiting wire, you can always cut those off and spur them. You can always remove extra material, but you can't put it back on. So it's always good to leave extra than less. If you have severe injury, it's good to leave longer spurs. And again, you want to be replacing trunks. This was an experiment I did just to show you how variable bud hardiness and bud survival can be on a given vine. So basically, at the experimental station, we stripped the vine. We took everything off of it and we measured the cold tolerance of every bud on that vine. And you could see here with the areas of gray, those are buds that are dead. This was done in January, end of January after we had some cold events. And then the yellow buds are medium hardiness, medium relative hardiness, low cold tolerance, and higher tolerance is the green. So you can see here that it can be quite variable within a given vine, but generally speaking, the lower buds in this particular case were a bit better shaped than what you'd expect in terms of hardiness, but also in terms of survival as well. So what I wanted to do is, number one, show you how variable a vine can be, and number two, explain if you did different pruning methods on this vine, what you'd be left with. So for example, if you would spur prune this vine to 2 bud spurs, so you basically just left these buds right here, you'd be left with about 16 viable buds. If you do 3 bud spurs, you'd be left with 21 viable buds. If you did 4 bud spurs, 27 viable buds, and if you did 5, it'd be 35 buds. Now if you cane prune this vine, you would have, if you only left 2 canes, you'd only be left with 8 viable buds. But if you left double the amount, you'd be at 22. So that just shows how pruning strategies can differ for a given vine, and how the way you decide to prune a vine is really important. Now, you're not going to have a crystal ball to see the data like this, but it can give you some idea in terms of when you're doing your bud sampling to look to see where the damage is. If a lot of your damage is occurring down here in your lower parts of the vine, let's say you had a radiation freeze and all that cold air settled below this line and you didn't have very many buds here, then you're better off to retain some of these longer canes and keep some of these buds that would be alive up here. If it's an event where there's a lot of damage on this section, this portion of the vine, then spur pruning is more advantageous. So in this case, I mean, you could, if you left 2 canes, you got 22 buds. If you did longer spurs, you're left with, like 3 bud spurs, you're left with the same amount. So in this vine, you could do either really in terms of what the selection you really want to do. So I just wanted to give you a demonstration of how it can vary in a vine, and just to explain what pruning is all about. It's not just about leaving them a number of buds. That's fine in a year where there's no cold injury. But for us, and we should always be mindful of this, is that when there's injury, you want to retain the buds that are alive. because that's what's going to produce the fruit for next year. And finally, just one point here in terms of factors that impact the final crop. We always get asked this question, oh, what's this year gonna be like in any given year? And so what I want to do here, just put some point form information about what impacts the final crop of a vine. So one is your primary bud survival. So, we're saying that there's some injury in grapevines. Okay, we have some injury in the vines. Well, next step is we have to see how to prune the vines and retain a proper number, as many viable buds as we can. So not only is bud survival important, but the number of buds retained that are viable is important. So if we leave double the amount of buds and we have 20% injury, we'll have more buds and we won't have 20% loss of buds that are left. Secondly is with those buds that we leave, how fruitful are those buds? And that all has to do with, in terms of primaries or secondaries. So if we have a lot of secondary loss in the vine, secondary bud loss, that might not be a very big deal because the primaries are the most fruitful, especially in vinifera. But in some cases, like in hybrids, the secondaries are also very fruitful. So not only is the number of buds that are retained, but in some cases, those buds are going to be a lot more fruitful than for some varieties than others. So the variety makes an impact. Obviously, the overall vine health has an impact. So if there's significant cold injury, and the cold injury there's a lot of damage to the trunks and to a lot of the perennial wood in the plant, that's going to have an impact in terms of crop levels, diseases. Whether it's mildews or virus or what have you, that can all impact the crop, and as well as any type of stress on the plant. Then we look at environmental conditions, both during bud development, so things that happened last year as well as this year, and then environmental conditions throughout the growing season. Timings of rain, whether it's during bloom, timing of rain during fruit development, all of this will have an impact in terms of final yields. We as growers, we remove a lot of crop off the vines to begin with. We drop it on the ground, either at bloom or after bloom when we're dropping actual clusters on the ground. So that all has an impact in terms of final crop levels. When we remove leaves and the timing of harvest, all of these have an impact in terms of the final crop. So when you look at the crop size on a vineyard level or a regional level, all of these factors come into play. So it's not easy to predict, and you can't really predict what your crop level is going to be. Later in the season you can, but not right now, especially. So what's some of the take-home messages from this winter? We've had a cold winter. It's been unprecedented in some cases, or at least a very strange winter in the last, since I can remember. I mean, I can't remember a winter we've had so many long cold periods. I think the severity of the lake freezing just indicates that and is indicative of that. We've had injury, but the severity is both appellation, variety, in sites, and it's also site-specific. We've had both some acute injury, but also probably some chronic injury due to some of the prolonged freezing events. And it's really critical to know what level of damage you have to make the correct decision. So going forward, it's really critical to know what level of damage is at the site. Like I said, it's impossible to predict what the harvest is going to be like next year, but it looks like it will be impacted by this winter. But the use of spare parts is really important. So if in those cases where growers left single chunks and didn't have a lot of spare parts, they're probably going to be more impacted this year than those that had a lot of spare parts, like multiple chunks and so on. Wind machines also play a factor, and so in cases where wind machines could be used, they were very effective, and I expect to see those vineyards looking better than those that couldn't use the wind machines or didn't have them. But a take-home message really here too is we get through these types of years, and even in areas where there's significant injury, we will bounce back. An example is in 2006, we had a large crop following the short crop of 2005. 2005 we had 21,000 tons in Ontario. The next year back up 3 times that. So we will get through this and get back into production. And I think through some of the information that we've learned and that we are learning, we're going to recover even quicker and get through this even better. I also think we're not going to have the same level of damage. I'm optimistic that we had in those years as well because of what we've learned. So in terms of some of the final thoughts here is that all of these things, such as variety, crop level, vintage, as well as a whole other bunch of other factors, can all impact cold tolerance. And just keep using the resources through COVI here and through the Vine Alert page, as well as information that's also disseminated through OMAF and the grape growers. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to learn from this winter, and through networking between the university and growers to growers and so on, I think there's a lot of information that we can learn, and that there's some opportunities for some real reactive cold hardiness projects. We've done a lot to look at optimizing cold tolerance and to help mitigate the damage, but now I think there's opportunities to look at how to recover from this since this happened during this cold hardness initiative, research initiative that we're doing. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to learn from this this past winter. So I'd like to acknowledge all the industry partners and funding agencies and so on, as well as technical services here at Brock University, and all of our grower partners as well for the projects that we're working on. So I thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
So we've got lots of time for questions, so I open up the floor.
Oops.
Before we break any of these. Well, I guess I'll start.
Okay.
When, with the data that we've collected this year, we know that there are certain regions that have a little more bud damage than other regions. We know that it's variety specific, site specific. What time of the year will we be better able to see overall impact, from our pruning mitigation strategies, and what that impact will be on the final crop? Like, what's the timeline that we're looking at for that?
Well, we'll really start to see some impact after bud break. And we're probably going to have a later bud break this year because of the conditions that we have. We're not going to be looking at an early April or a mid-April, late April bud break. So after bud break, we're going to get some signs in terms of what buds are pushing. We'll also get some indication through if there's a lot of suckering from the trunk, we'll be able to see that there's probably some further damage to the vine other than just buds. And so we'll start to get a sense, mid-spring, late spring, and we'll have a real indication once we hit July. And we start to see some stress on the vines in terms of some evaporative demand and the hotter temperatures and not as much water. That's when we start seeing some shutdown in the vines and some collapse. So we'll really get an indication. We'll get the first indication after bud break, and we start seeing some of the vines pushing, and then once we start getting a larger canopy, we'll really start to see the impacts and see what level of crop we have as well, because we may get some growth, but we may not have much fruit on those vines. But we really have to wait to see what grows. I mean, that's the...
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about timing of pruning and its interaction upon bud hardiness and mitigating bud hardiness damage in terms of, a lot of people are pruned before these events and are not able to do anything about that. And I don't know if then delaying pruning now, this time of year, is going to be something that's going to help.
So in terms of pruning, if you prune severely and you did a lot of clean pruning early, you're going to probably be in some trouble in many cases. And so the earlier you prune, the more buds you want to leave just in general. Like, I understand you have to get a lot of vineyards pruned, but if you start pruning early, the recommendation is to prune your most cold tolerant vines first. So if you have things like Baco and Vidal, prune those first and prune your most sensitive things last, because you have this long winter where injury can occur. And once you hit this time of year where the vines are deacclimating, this is when real damage can occur. So it's good to leave your sensitive varieties to the end. In terms of earlier pruning, we've done a little bit of work, and there's been other work done in terms of timing of pruning and bud break and deacclimation and so on. What we've found is that earlier pruned vines didn't really deacclimate any faster than the other ones. And in terms of bud break, it was just slightly earlier bud break than those pruned later. But generally speaking, the later you prune, the more you'll delay bud break as well. But in terms of cold tolerance, we did some work last year where we looked at unpruned vines, pre-pruned vines, pruned vines, and then severely pruned vines. That was our categories. And we didn't find a lot of difference in terms of bud hardiness throughout dormancy. We did find a little bit of difference in terms of timing, or in terms of percentage of bud break at the beginning of May in the vines that were more severely pruned was slightly earlier in terms of bud break. But pre-pruning had no impact. That's another question growers always ask: is what does pre-pruning do? Nothing. We haven't found any differences in that at all.
Well, Jim, thank you again for a great talk and a great update on the status of where we're at this year with our vines. A small token of our appreciation. And also just an announcement that our lecture on Monday, March 17th will be our enologist, Dr. Belinda Kemp. And Belinda will be talking about another outreach program that she's developing, but on the enological side, called Tannin Alert, a wine tannin management system for Niagara wineries. So I look forward to seeing you all back here next week. Thank you.